All right, let's talk about one of the most tragic and disturbing figures in Warhammer 40k, Konrad Curze, the Night Haunter. Few names in the grim darkness of the far future evoke such a mix of fear, pity, and morbid fascination. He was a Primarch, a genetic demigod, created to be a savior of humanity, yet his name became synonymous with terror. His story is not just one of brutality and horror, it's a tale of fate, free will, and the crushing weight of prophecy. Was he always destined to fall into darkness, or was there ever a chance he could have been saved? Some argue that from the moment he was cast onto Nostromo, his doom was sealed. Others believe his choices, though shaped by circumstance, were still his own. But where do we draw the line between destiny and agency? That's what we'll explore as we unravel the tragedy of Conrad Curze and ask the ultimate question: was the Night Haunter truly doomed from the start? Conrad Curze's story begins in the worst possible place a being like him could have landed: Nostromo. A world so steeped in corruption and decay that even the light of its dying sun couldn't pierce through the eternal gloom. It wasn't just a planet. It was a graveyard of hope, a place where life had no value, and the strong fed on the weak without a second thought. When the infant Primarch crashed into its surface, he was alone, abandoned in a city that existed in perpetual night, where crime wasn't just rampant. It was the law. Some say the Imperium doomed him the moment it lost him to the warp. Others believe Nostromo simply revealed what was already inside him. Unlike other Primarchs who were taken in by leaders or noble warriors, Curze had no one. He survived the only way he could, by hunting. A predator in a city of prey, stalking the streets, killing those who would kill him first. He had no teachers, no father figure, no guiding hand to tell him there was another way. And so he taught himself, and the lesson he learned was brutal. Survival is a war, and the only way to win is through fear. People feared the dark because they knew what lurked within it. Curze was the dark. There's a popular theory among fans that Nostromo wasn't just a terrible place. It was a reflection of the Night Haunter himself. That if he had landed anywhere else, his nature might have been different. But could he really have been anything other than what he became? Some point to his psychic abilities as proof that his fate was already sealed. He didn't just see the world as it was. He saw what it would be. Nightmares plagued him from the very beginning, visions of horror and death that he could never escape. Imagine being a child, waking up every night knowing the future is nothing but blood and screams. How do you grow up normal after that? Yet, there are those who argue that even in the filth and violence of Nostromo, there were choices. That other lost souls had suffered just as much and did not become monsters. But here's the thing. Curze didn't see himself as a monster. He saw himself as a force of justice, a necessary evil. He didn't kill for pleasure. He wasn't a sadist reveling in the suffering of others like the Dark Eldar. He killed because he believed it was the only way to bring order. If fear kept people in line, then fear was the answer. But was he ever truly in control? That's the real question. Nostromo shaped him, twisted him, but how much of that was him? And how much was the world around him? His mind was fractured from the very beginning, haunted by visions of doom. Some think he was a prisoner of his own sight, a man watching himself fall and powerless to stop it. Others believe he chose his path, that he saw his own darkness and embraced it. If another Primarch had landed there, would they have suffered the same fate? Some say yes, that Nostromo was a death sentence for any child, even one as powerful as a Primarch. Others believe it had to be him, that Curze and Nostromo were two sides of the same coin. One created the other and there was no escaping it. Maybe in another life, another time, he could have been different. But Nostromo didn't give second chances. It swallowed him whole and spat out the Night Haunter. And once that name was born, there was no turning back. When Conrad Curze finally stepped out of the shadows and revealed himself to Nostromo, he didn't come as a conqueror or a warlord. He came as something far worse, a judge, a specter of vengeance, a force of nature that no one could oppose. For years, the criminals of Nostromo had ruled unchecked, their power built on fear and brutality. But they had never known true terror. Not until the Night Haunter arrived. He didn't rally the people. He didn't make speeches or lead armies. He simply started killing. One by one, he hunted down the worst of Nostromo's scum, the crime lords and murderers who had turned the planet into a festering wound. And he didn't just kill them. He made examples of them. Their bodies were left in the streets, torn apart with surgical precision, their deaths a message written in blood. People whispered about a ghost, a monster that could not be stopped, that saw everything and punished without mercy. And it worked. Nostromo, a world that had never known order, began to change. The streets emptied at night. Crime plummeted to nothing. The people lived in fear, but for the first time in generations, they lived. The question is, was it justice, or was it the first sign of something much darker? Some argue that what Curze did was necessary, that Nostromo was too far gone for kindness, that only absolute terror could break the cycle of violence. They compare him to the imperium itself. After all, the emperor's rule is built on the same principle: fear of exterminatus, fear of the Inquisition, fear of what happens when you step out of line. In that sense, was Curze really so different? Or was he simply doing on a planetary scale what the imperium does to the galaxy? But there's a flaw in that argument. The emperor's rule, for all its cruelty, is built on a vision of unity, of something greater. Curze's justice had no higher purpose. There was no future, no grand design. There was only fear, and fear can never last forever. The people of Nostromo obeyed because they were afraid, but did they change? That's the real question. Because justice is supposed to uplift, to create something stronger, something better. But all Curze did was hold a knife to the planet's throat and whisper, "Move, and you die." That's not order. That's not justice. That's just waiting for the inevitable. And the inevitable came. The cracks started small. Whispers that maybe the Night Haunter wasn't watching. That maybe he couldn't see everything. That maybe, just maybe, the darkness wasn't as absolute as they had believed. And the moment that doubt crept in, Nostromo's old ways began to slither back. The rot had never truly left. It had only been afraid to show itself. This is where the debate among fans really heats up. Some say Curze was a tragic hero, that he tried to fix a broken world in the only way he knew how, that he was a product of his upbringing, and that if he had been shown another way, he might have ruled differently. Others argue that his methods were doomed from the start, that fear alone is never enough, and that his rule was just another kind of tyranny, one that could never last. But maybe the most damning thing of all is that Curze knew it. He knew fear could only take him so far. He saw the future, and in that future everything he built would crumble. And yet, he did it anyway. Why? Because deep down, maybe he didn't believe in anything else. Maybe to him, justice and terror were the same thing. Or maybe on some level, he had already accepted that he would never be a savior, only a monster trying to hold back the darkness, knowing it would swallow him in the end. When Conrad Curze was given command of his own legion, it wasn't a fresh start. It was an extension of what he had already built. The 8th Legion, later known as the Night Lords, didn't just adopt his philosophy, they became it. Where other legions had their own cultures, traditions, and ideals, the Night Lords had only one thing: fear. And from the very beginning, that fear was both their greatest weapon and their greatest curse. Unlike many of his brothers, Curze didn't try to reshape his legion into something noble. There was no illusion of honor like with the Dark Angels, no pursuit of perfection like the Emperor's children. The warriors he inherited were brutal enforcers, originally recruited from Terra's most ruthless gangs. When he took command, he didn't civilize them, he refined them. He stripped away any remaining restraint and turned them into a force of pure psychological warfare. If the enemy surrendered, they would still die because fear was the point. It wasn't about winning battles, it was about making sure no one dared to fight in the first place. But here's the real question. Was there ever a chance for the Night Lords to be something else? Could they have been more than executioners? Some fans argue that they could have, that under different leadership, with a different perspective, the 8th Legion might have been like the Ultramarines, coldly efficient, but not sadistic. Others disagree, saying that Curze's darkness infected them from the start, that even without him, their methods would have led them down the same path. One of the biggest signs that the Night Lords were doomed from the beginning is how they enjoyed what they became. Other legions followed their Primarchs out of duty, loyalty, or belief in their cause. The Night Lords followed Curze because they believed in fear. They saw the galaxy as a lawless, brutal place, and in their minds they were simply bringing the only form of order that worked. Some even took it further than Curze himself. He used terror as a tool, but many of his sons relished it. They turned cruelty into an art form, and as time went on, they cared less and less about justice and more about inflicting suffering. That's what makes the Night Lords such a fascinating tragedy. They weren't mindless berserkers like the World Eaters or twisted by the warp like the Death Guard. They chose their path, and in some ways, that makes them even worse. Because you can't excuse what they did as madness or corruption. It was a philosophy, a belief system, one that they willingly embraced. Of course, not all of them were the same. There were still those who saw themselves as enforcers of justice, who believed they were preventing greater horrors by being the lesser evil. But they were a dying breed. Over time, the worst elements of the Legion took control, and any sense of purpose they once had faded into sadism and chaos. Some fans believe this was inevitable, that Curze himself made sure of it. He never saw a future for his Legion outside of destruction. He didn't build them up like Guilliman did with the Ultramarines. He didn't create a culture of brotherhood like Leman Russ did with the Space Wolves. He let them rot. He let them become monsters. Maybe he even wanted it that way. Because if his own sons became the very thing he feared, then it only proved what he had always believed, that the galaxy was beyond saving, that justice and cruelty were one and the same. In the end, the Night Lords didn't fall because of chaos. They didn't fall because of betrayal. They fell because they had nothing else. No ideals, no vision, just fear. And fear, no matter how powerful, can't build an empire. It can only tear one down. When Conrad Curze finally stood before the Emperor, it should have been a turning point. A moment of salvation. A chance for a broken soul to be lifted from the darkness and shown another way. Other Primarchs had been raised by rulers, by warriors, by people who, in their own flawed ways, tried to guide them. Curze had nothing. No mentors, no family, no warmth. The Emperor was the first true authority he had ever met, the only being more powerful than himself. And yet, instead of finding answers, Curze found something far worse: confirmation. Imagine spending your entire life believing the universe is cruel and inevitable, that justice and horror are the same thing, that the future is written in blood, and you are powerless to change it. Then, one day, the closest thing to a god arrives and doesn't prove you wrong. He doesn't tell you there's another way. He doesn't even seem surprised by what you are, because that's the thing. When the Emperor found Curze, he didn't recoil. He didn't show disappointment. He simply looked at him and accepted him. Some fans argue that this was an act of mercy, that the Emperor saw beyond the horror and still welcomed Curze as his son. But others see something much darker. That in that moment, the Emperor didn't see a child who needed saving. He saw a weapon, a necessary evil. It's easy to understand why Curze followed him. He had been alone his entire life. When the Emperor called him his son, it meant something. But did it really change anything? Curze's beliefs weren't challenged. His methods weren't corrected. He wasn't saved. He was simply given a larger stage to play out his nightmares. This is where the debate among fans really intensifies. Could the Emperor have done more? Could he have guided Curze down another path? Some say yes, that with the right care, the right words, Curze might have learned to see the world differently, that he might have become something more than just a monster lurking in the shadows of the Imperium. But the problem is that Curze never saw himself as a monster, and the Emperor, for all his power, didn't see himself as a father. He saw himself as a ruler. He didn't raise his sons, he deployed them, and Curze, more than any of his brothers, needed something more than orders. He needed someone to challenge him, to show him a different way, to prove to him that his visions weren't the only possible future. But the Emperor wasn't that person. He wasn't one for sentimentality, and he certainly wasn't one for comfort. Maybe he thought Curze would find his own way. Maybe he simply didn't care. Or maybe, on some level, he knew what Curze would become and decided it didn't matter. That as long as he served his purpose, the cost was irrelevant. If that's true, then the Emperor's greatest failure wasn't that he let Curze fall. It's that he never truly tried to stop it. He saw a brutal, ruthless executioner and let him be just that. He didn't give Curze a new philosophy, a new purpose. He just let him be. And Curze, for all his darkness, was still just a man trying to understand his own fate. When he asked the Emperor if his visions were true, if the future was set in stone, he wasn't looking for validation. He was looking for hope. And the Emperor, in his cold, calculated way, gave him nothing. He told him what he already feared, that the worst was inevitable, that everything he saw would come to pass, that he was, in the end, doomed. Maybe that was the moment everything was sealed. Maybe if the Emperor had given him even the smallest reassurance, Curze would have fought against his fate. But he didn't. And so the Night Haunter kept walking toward the darkness, believing that there had never been another path to take. When the Great Crusade began, it was supposed to be the moment the Primarchs truly stepped into their roles as saviors of humanity. For many of them, it was a chance to prove themselves, to build legacies that would last for millennia. But for Conrad Curze, it was something different. It was validation, a test to see if his vision of justice, his cold, merciless philosophy, was truly what the Imperium needed. And for a time, it seemed like it was. Curze wasn't like his brothers. He didn't lead from the front like the Lion, or inspire loyalty like Guilliman. He didn't revel in battle like Angron, or chase glory like Fulgrim. He was a shadow. He moved unseen, striking where his enemies were weakest, breaking their will before they even knew they were at war. His methods weren't just effective, they were terrifying. The worlds he brought into compliance didn't just surrender, they submitted. Entire populations were reduced to silence, terrified of what would happen if they stepped out of line. No rebellions, no uprisings, just obedience, bought with blood, and the Imperium let him do it. That's the part that so many people forget. The Emperor's grand vision of unity had room for monsters, as long as they got results. The Night Lords weren't censured for their brutality. They weren't told to stop. In fact, some of the greatest Imperial strategists saw their methods as a necessary evil. After all, what's worse? A world that falls after years of war, or a world that surrenders instantly because it fears what will happen if it doesn't? The logic was cold, brutal, but undeniably effective. So was this his chance at redemption? Could he have turned things around if he had just found the right influence, the right reason to be something more? Some fans believe that for a brief moment, Curze could have changed, that he could have seen his role not as an executioner, but as a protector. There's evidence that he cared about his legion in his own way, that he believed he was doing what was best for humanity. And if someone, whether it was the Emperor, one of his brothers, or even a mortal, had given him a different perspective, maybe he would have embraced it. But the problem was, no one did. The Imperium let him be a monster. His brothers hated him. Not all of them, but enough. Guilliman saw him as a disgrace. Dorn saw him as an aberration. The only ones who seemed to tolerate him were those who either didn't care, like the Khan, or those who had their own darkness to deal with, like Lorgar. Curze didn't have a home among his brothers. He was the outcast, the freak. And as the years passed, that isolation only grew. And then, there were his visions. They never stopped. He saw everything, all the horrors to come, and no one believed him. Imagine knowing that no matter what you do, it all ends in ruin. That every battle, every victory is meaningless because the galaxy will drown in war. That's the part people don't always consider when they talk about his brutality. He knew it didn't matter. He wasn't building an empire. He was just delaying the inevitable. Some say that if Curze had been wrong, he might have had a chance. If his visions had been false, if there had been even a glimmer of hope, maybe he would have held on to it. But the worst part, he was right. The Imperium did turn on itself. The Emperor did die in a way. The Great Crusade wasn't the dawn of a golden age. It was just another step toward the nightmare that Curze had always known was coming. So could he have been saved? Maybe. But not by the Imperium, not by his brothers, not by the Emperor, who never once told him that his fate wasn't set in stone. If redemption was ever possible, it would have had to come from something beyond all of them. Something that never arrived. And so Curze, as he always had, followed the only path he believed was left to him, the one leading straight into the abyss. Conrad Curze was never going to stay loyal to the Imperium, not because he wanted to betray it, not because he craved power like Horus or sought forbidden knowledge like Magnus, but because the Imperium itself was never going to accept him. His methods had always been extreme, but for years they were tolerated. Feared, yes, hated even, but tolerated because they got results. But the moment the Imperium no longer needed him, the moment his brutality became inconvenient rather than useful, it turned on him. And once that happened, there was no going back. The breaking point wasn't a single moment. It was a slow collapse. The first cracks had always been there, from the way his brothers looked at him to the way Imperial commanders whispered about his tactics behind closed doors. The Night Lords were never celebrated like the Ultramarines or the Imperial Fists. They didn't win glory. They didn't make speeches. They didn't embody the nobility of the Emperor's vision. They were executioners, and no one wants to think about the executioner until they need him. But the real moment everything started unraveling was when Curze stopped being tolerated and started being condemned. Imperial authorities began questioning his methods. His own brothers started distancing themselves. Reports of the Night Lord's atrocities became impossible to ignore, and soon enough, they were branded as criminals rather than warriors. But what made it worse, what made it unbearable, was that nothing had changed. Curze wasn't suddenly more brutal than before. He had always ruled through fear. He had always executed without hesitation. The Imperium hadn't cared when it needed him, but now that it was more convenient to call him a monster, it acted like it was shocked by what he had done. That's what truly set him against the Imperium, not just the hypocrisy, but the betrayal. They had made him this way. They had let him do what he did. And now they wanted to turn their backs on him, as if they had no part in it. As if they had always been the righteous ones, and he had always been the aberration. No, that he would not accept. Some fans argue that Curze was already too far gone by this point, that even if the Imperium had embraced him, he still would have turned against it, that his paranoia, his visions, and his sense of inevitable doom would have driven him to rebellion no matter what. And there's some truth to that. His nightmares never stopped. He saw the Imperium burning, saw the betrayal, saw his own death long before it ever came. But the tragedy is that he didn't want to betray the Emperor. He never saw himself as a traitor. Unlike Horus, he wasn't leading a grand rebellion. Unlike Lorgar, he wasn't trying to reshape the galaxy in his own image. He was lashing out, striking back at something he believed had already cast him aside. And maybe that's the biggest difference between him and the other traitor Primarchs. Most of them betrayed the Imperium because they wanted something. Power, revenge, validation. Curze didn't want anything. He had already accepted his own destruction. He wasn't trying to build something new. He wasn't trying to take the Emperor's place. He just wanted to make them see. To force the Imperium to acknowledge its own cruelty, its own hypocrisy. To show them that he was never the monster. They were. But did he really have a choice? That's where opinions start to divide. Some say his fall was inevitable, that from the moment he landed on Nostromo, from the moment the Emperor refused to give him hope, there was no other path for him. Others argue that he could have fought it, that he could have proved himself to be more than the monster the Imperium believed him to be. But how do you prove you're not a monster when the whole galaxy already sees you as one? In the end, it didn't matter. The Imperium turned on him, and he turned on it right back. Not as a conqueror, not as a visionary, but as a man who had already accepted his own damnation. He didn't fight to win. He fought because it was all he had left. Of all the curses that plagued Konrad Curze, none tormented him more than his visions. From the moment he could think, he saw the future, not in glimpses, not in cryptic riddles, but in horrifying, unavoidable detail. He saw the Imperium turning against him before he had even sworn loyalty to it. He saw his own death before he had even left Nostromo. He saw ruin and war and fire and blood, and worst of all, he saw that nothing he did could stop it. Was it truly prophecy? That's the debate that has raged among fans for years. Some believe Curze's visions were absolute, that he saw the future exactly as it was meant to be, and no force in the universe could have altered it. If that's true, then his entire existence was a tragedy beyond comprehension. He was a man running in circles, screaming into the void, fighting against a storm that had already consumed him. His fall wasn't a choice. It was written before he even took his first breath. But there's another theory, one that makes his story even darker. What if his visions weren't of an inevitable future, but simply one of many possibilities? What if he could have changed things, but he was so convinced he couldn't that he made it all come true? The idea that he wasn't cursed by fate, but by his own belief in it, is something that haunts every discussion about him. If he had fought just a little harder, if he had ignored the whispers in his mind, if he had believed in something other than death and despair, could things have been different? Some argue that the biggest proof that Curze's future wasn't set in stone is that not everything he predicted came true. His visions weren't always exact. He saw Horus winning the war, but Horus lost. He saw the Emperor's death, but the Emperor didn't truly die. His predictions, while terrifyingly accurate most of the time, weren't flawless. That means there was room for change. The problem was, Curze never believed that, and that's the real tragedy. He didn't just see his own destruction, he embraced it. He became obsessed with the idea that he was doomed, that nothing he did mattered, that every action he took was just another step toward the end he had already foreseen. It's why he let Nostromo fall back into darkness instead of truly reforming it. It's why he let his legion descend into madness instead of guiding them. He didn't fight against his fate. He made sure it happened. But was that really a curse? Or was it just an excuse? That's where the debate gets even murkier. There are those who believe Curze used his visions as a way to justify everything he did. If the future was already set, then it didn't matter how many people he slaughtered. It didn't matter if he became a monster. He wasn't choosing to be cruel. He was simply playing his part. That's what makes him so terrifying. He didn't see himself as a villain. He saw himself as a man who had already lost. And yet, there's something undeniably tragic about it. Because if his visions were real, if his fate was unavoidable, then nothing he did was ever truly his fault. He was simply trapped in a nightmare, screaming for help in a universe that never listened. He wasn't just a killer. He was a victim of time itself, a man forced to watch himself fall and unable to do anything about it. So was his gift a blessing or a curse? The answer depends on whether you believe fate is set in stone. If his visions were absolute, then he was the most tragic figure in the history of the Imperium, a man born to suffer, to destroy, to die, with no hope of escape. But if the future could have been changed, if he had even the slightest chance to fight back, then he was something far worse. He was a man who gave up. And maybe, in the end, that was the real curse all along. Conrad Curze didn't die in battle, screaming defiance like Angron. He didn't meet his end fighting for a cause, like Horus or Sanguinius. He died sitting on a throne of corpses, waiting for the inevitable, daring fate to prove him wrong. And when the assassin came, he did nothing to stop it. That's what makes his end so haunting. He chose it. He didn't fight. He didn't resist. He didn't rage against the dying of the light. He simply accepted it as if it had already happened long ago. And maybe in his mind it had. The question is, was that an act of despair, or was it something more? Some argue that it was pure nihilism, that by the time his final days arrived, Curze had nothing left to live for. His legion was shattered, reduced to nothing but sadistic war bands hunting for their next kill. His visions had come true in the worst possible ways. The Imperium had turned against him, his brothers had abandoned him, and the Emperor, his supposed father, had never once tried to stop it. If Curze was ever looking for a reason to believe in anything, he never found it. And so, when the assassin arrived, he saw no point in running, no point in fighting back. If anything, he welcomed it, not as punishment, not as justice, but as the final irrefutable proof that he had been right all along. That the Imperium was every bit as cruel and hypocritical as he had always believed. That it didn't care about justice, only about silencing its problems. And if his own death could serve as the ultimate example of that truth, then so be it. But there's another perspective, one that paints his death in a very different light. What if it wasn't surrender? What if it was defiance? Curze had spent his entire life trying to prove a point about the Imperium, about fate, about himself. And when the assassin came for him, he made sure his death would serve as his final statement. He refused to struggle. He refused to give the Imperium the satisfaction of thinking they had defeated him. If they wanted him dead, they could kill him, but they wouldn't break him. They wouldn't make him beg. Some fans even argue that this was his last victory, that by embracing his own death, he robbed the Imperium of any power over him, that in the end, he was still the one in control, even as the knife plunged into his chest. He had spent his entire life believing he was trapped in an unchangeable future, and in that final moment, he proved that the only thing he had ever truly owned was his end. But could he have escaped it? That's where the debate becomes truly painful, because the answer is probably yes. If Curze had wanted to run, he could have. He was still a Primarch. Even in his final days, even weakened, he was faster, stronger, and more dangerous than any mortal being. The assassin sent to kill him didn't stand a chance if he had actually wanted to survive. But he didn't, because in his mind he was already dead, and that's what makes him such a tragic figure. He had the power to change things. Maybe not the whole galaxy, maybe not even his own fate, but he could have chosen to keep going, to fight, to try. But he didn't believe in anything anymore. Not in justice, not in redemption, not in himself. In the end, whether his death was a statement or a surrender, whether it was an act of defiance or pure nihilism, one truth remains: Curze chose to die. And in a universe where gods and monsters battle for eternity, that might be the most human thing about him. Was Conrad Curze always doomed? Was he ever truly free to choose his own path? Or was he just a puppet of fate, playing out a story that had already been written? That's the question that defines him. It's what makes him more than just another fallen Primarch, more than just another cautionary tale about power and madness. His entire existence is a debate about destiny, whether he was cursed from the beginning, or whether he simply made the worst possible choices every step of the way. There's a strong argument that Curze never had a chance. He was thrown into the worst possible environment, left to survive on a world that devoured anything weak. He had no guidance, no structure, no father figure to tell him that justice didn't have to come at the end of a blade. And then there were his visions. He knew how it would all end before it even began. How do you fight against something when you're convinced the outcome is already set? How do you hold on to hope when every time you close your eyes, you see yourself falling? Some fans believe that he was the Imperium's greatest tragedy, a being who could have been a force for true justice, but who was instead shaped into a monster because that's all he was ever allowed to be. The Emperor didn't try to change him. His brothers didn't try to save him. The Imperium used him when it was convenient and discarded him when it wasn't. And when he finally realized he had never truly belonged, that he had never been anything more than a tool, he turned against the only thing he had ever known. But there's another way to look at it. What if Curze wasn't a victim of fate? What if he simply chose to lean into his worst instincts, again and again, until there was nothing left of him but terror and death? There were other Primarchs who suffered, who were raised in darkness, and who still managed to rise above it. Lorgar was abandoned and humiliated, but he found faith. Angron was tortured and enslaved, but he still fought for his people, even if it cost him everything. Even Mortarion, who had every reason to hate the Emperor, still tried, however briefly, to be more than just a warlord. Curze never really tried. He justified. Every horror he committed, every act of cruelty, was excused by his belief that it was necessary. That fear was the only path to order, that there was no future except the one he had already seen. And maybe that's the real tragedy. Not that he was doomed, but that he convinced himself he was. That he let his visions become a self-fulfilling prophecy, and in doing so, guaranteed his own destruction. Because, at the end of the day, fate didn't make Curze butcher the people of Nostromo. Fate didn't force him to let his legion become a pack of sadists. Fate didn't make him sit on a throne of corpses and wait for death. He did that. He chose that. He could have fought against it. He could have tried to prove the universe wrong. But instead, he let the darkness consume him, because deep down, maybe he wanted it to. Maybe it was easier to accept damnation than to fight against it. And that's why his story still haunts people. Because if Curze was doomed from the start, then none of it was his fault. But if he wasn't, if he really did have a choice, then everything he became was something he allowed himself to be. And that's a fate far worse than being cursed. That's a tragedy of his own making. There's one final question that lingers in the shadows of Conrad Curze's legacy. Was he truly alone in his fate? Or was he simply the first to fall? It's easy to look at Curze and see him as an anomaly, a singular tragedy among the Primarchs. But when you step back and look at the bigger picture, his story isn't as unique as it first appears. If anything, he was just the most extreme example of a pattern that played out across the entire Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy. Because when you really break it down, how many of the Primarchs actually escaped their own downfall? How many of them truly had a choice in what they became? Lorgar was shaped by faith before he even knew what the Imperium was. Angron was broken long before the Emperor ever found him. Mortarion was raised in hatred and fear. Alpharius and Omegon were taught deception from the moment they were discovered. Even Horus, the greatest of them all, the one who was supposed to be the Emperor's heir, was ultimately a victim of manipulation and prophecy. They were all shaped by their origins, their environments, and their circumstances. Some fought against it, others embraced it, but none of them walked away unscathed. So was Curze really that different? Or was he just the one who saw it all coming? That's the part that makes his tragedy so unsettling. He didn't just fall. He knew he was going to fall. He saw the future in ways that even Magnus couldn't comprehend. And unlike his brothers who still clung to their own illusions, Curze had no delusions left. He didn't believe in fate as a philosophical debate. He experienced it every day, every night. He lived in his own death long before it ever happened. Some fans argue that this is what truly broke him, that it wasn't just Nostromo or the Imperium's betrayal or his own madness. It was the weight of knowing how it all ended. Most of his brothers had at least some hope, some dream of what could have been. Even the traitors fought for something, even if that something was a lie. But Curze had nothing. No illusions, no cause, no belief that things could ever be different. And when you have nothing left to hold on to, what else is there but the abyss? But maybe there's another way to look at it. Maybe Curze wasn't alone in his fate. Maybe he was just the first to accept it. Because in the end, none of the Primarchs were free. They were all pawns in a game far larger than themselves. The Emperor didn't raise them to be men. He created them to be weapons. And weapons don't get to choose how they are used. So perhaps the real tragedy of Conrad Curze isn't just that he fell. It's that he understood what was happening to him in a way that none of his brothers did. He didn't fight it like Magnus, or rage against it like Angron, or try to rewrite it like Lorgar. He simply saw it, and when the time came, he accepted it. Not because he wanted to, not because he was weak, but because in the end, he knew something that no one else did. That fate always wins. And no matter how much you fight, no matter how hard you struggle, the end will always come. The only question is whether you meet it screaming, or whether you sit on your throne and watch it unfold, just as you always knew it would. So, was Conrad Curze truly a victim of fate? Or was that just an excuse for the horrors he unleashed? That's the heart of his tragedy, the question that lingers long after his story ends. Some will always see him as a doomed figure, a man who never had a choice, cursed with visions of a future he could never escape. Others will argue that he was the architect of his own downfall, that he let his despair consume him and used fate as a shield to justify his cruelty. The truth? It's probably both. And that's what makes him one of the most fascinating and disturbing figures in Warhammer 40K. If you strip everything else away, his powers, his visions, his position as a Primarch, what you're left with is a man who believed he was already damned. And whether or not that was true, that belief shaped everything he did. He never sought redemption because he never thought it was possible. He never truly tried to build something lasting because he was convinced everything was already falling apart. He never fought against his own darkness because he didn't see a reason to. And in the end, that's what sealed his fate. Not prophecy, not the Imperium, not even the Emperor's indifference. It was him. But that's what makes his story so compelling. Because whether you see him as a monster or a martyr, there's something undeniably human about him. He wasn't just some warlord chasing power or a zealot trying to reshape the galaxy. He was afraid. He was lost. He saw the world in a way no one else could, and instead of hope, all he saw was death. And when you spend your entire life expecting the worst, eventually, you start making sure it happens. In the end, Conrad Curze didn't just embrace his fate. He became it. He let his nightmares define him, let his fears turn him into the very thing he claimed to despise. Maybe, in some way, he thought he was proving a point. That the Imperium was just as cruel as he was. That justice and terror were the same thing. That there was never another way. But that's what makes his tragedy so unbearable. Because deep down, we all know that there was another way. He just never believed in it. So, was he destined for damnation? Or did he just walk willingly into the abyss? That's for you to decide. But one thing is certain. There has never been, and never will be, another like the Night Haunter. And in the grim darkness of the far future, his name will always be whispered in fear, not because of what he did, but because of what he could have been. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most haunting figures in Warhammer 40K, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss out on more lore breakdowns, fan theories, and dark explorations of the universe we all love. And let me know in the comments, was Curze truly a victim of fate, or was he just a man who refused to fight for anything more?